So we begin this last section, really. We finished those chapters 8 and 9 dealing with the contribution that Paul was gathering. And we saw this throughout the book of Acts. We see it in Romans and other places. This contribution that he was gathering from the Gentile churches, especially those on the European continent, in Achaia and Macedonia, that he was going to take back to Judea for the poor saints there. And as he's gathering this contribution, of course, he has this extensive discussion on giving, the most extensive discussion in the New Testament. And so it is an outline for us as far as our giving and generosity and so forth, in not only giving to the work of the Lord in general, but to help other people. And so really chapter 10 through the rest of the book begins the last section of the book, 10, 11, 12, 13, where he gets back to defending himself to his critics there in Corinth. As we've said before, most likely, we don't know for sure, and certainly wasn't the whole church, but most likely these were men that had come from without. He talks about, remember early in the book, they had letters, so-called letters of recommendation, commendation. But most likely Judaizing teachers of some sort from perhaps from the Jerusalem church or something like that. And Paul had dealt with that some already, but he's going to deal with it extensively. And really chapter 11 is just an outstanding chapter when you want to study the character of Paul and what it takes to be like him. As he said, imitate me as I also imitate Christ. And I don't know of another person in the New Testament that we would want to imitate more than Christ. Other than Christ, it would be Paul, I think. And chapter 11 really bears that out. But as we finish chapter 10 quickly, and I think Gage covered most of that, in the first part of the chapter, he responds to charges of inconsistency and cowardice, charges of walking according to the flesh. And then he gets into issues of his authority, beginning in about verse 7, because there were charges against his, it's just like politics, I guess, but as we said, when you can't answer a person's positions or his logic, then you just resort to what? Yeah, personal attacks, and that's kind of what these guys were doing with Paul against his personal qualities. But he affirms there, of course, beginning in chapter 7, that he was at least on the same level, if not above these people, in that he had been invested authority from Christ, and they were criticizing. They would say things like, his letters, he's weak in bodily presence, but, his letters make him sound tougher and stronger than he is, and that kind of thing. And, he points out that, look, I don't use the same false standards of measurement that they use, comparing themselves by themselves. But he said, I will confine my boasting, where does he say, within the sphere, I guess you might say, of his authority. That word in verse 13, sphere, I think is a good translation. It's generally not translated that way. It's the word canon. From when we get the word, our English words, usually it's translated rule or standard. But in this context, I think this is a good translation, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us. And by the way, he says the limits or that area that area of authority that God has appointed me includes who, by the way? It includes you, because what? After all, he's the one that did what? He's the one that taught them. He's the one that brought them the gospel and established this congregation. And we said, look, these fellows, they don't have the same authority over you that I do. First of all, I'm an apostle, but number two, I've been given this sphere of authority, and it's over you as well. I'm the one that established this congregation. And he said, and I don't go around, by the way, boasting in other men's labors like these fellows. And what he's saying, of course, is that's what these guys are doing. They're going around, and that's kind of the way these fellows are, even today. Sometimes you sit down, maybe you have a personal conversation with a preacher from some other part of the country, or maybe even across the world, a missionary in some country who's labored for years and established a good congregation of the Lord's church and worked hard, and then maybe he leaves, and what happens? Somebody else from the United States comes in that is a false teacher and then just takes them off in some other direction, and that's, of course, heart-wrenching for that person who's put in all that work. But that's what these people were doing. They weren't building, they weren't establishing anything new. They weren't going out and building up the body of Christ. They were just coming in and trying to take over somebody's labor that had already been done. And so Paul says, I don't do that. For we are not overextending ourselves as though our authority did not extend to you, for it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ. We're the ones that established this congregation. Not boasting of things beyond measure, verse 15, that is, in other men's labors, but having hope that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishment. What was Paul's hope for this church? After he had already established them, and after they had had time to grow, then what was his hope for them? That they would be able to do what? What's God's hope for every congregation of the Lord's people, really? Yeah, then to reach out and take the gospel and help get the gospel into other areas. And Paul said, that was my hope for you, to be able to go to regions beyond you, and that you would help me in that, greatly enlarged by you, to preach the gospel in regions beyond you, and not to boast in it. It's not my intent to go around, trampling on another man's work and taking credit for it. I want to go places where the gospel's not been. And I want you to help me in that. That's my expectation. But he who glories, that word for glory there is maybe better translated boast, the way we think of it. But he who glories or boasts, let him glory where? You want to glory in something? You want to boast in something? Do it in the Lord. For not he who commends. Now here's the bottom line. Back up in verse 12, these fellows are commending, and they're comparing themselves with themselves, measuring themselves by themselves. He said that's not wise. Why is that? Well, in verse 18, for not he who commends himself is approved. Now, these guys came in, supposedly with these letters of commendation, and we're all that. And it's not about me commending myself, but who? What does he say? But whom the Lord commends. And I suspect that, in his mind there, he's thinking, can't help me but thinking that, that's really what it's all about, right? Chapter 5, verse 10. We're all going to stand where? Where are we going to stand? For the judgment seat of Christ. He who glories, let him glory in the Lord. Boast, Paul would boast, but his boasting was regard to him being a partner in the work of Christ. I like what one commentator said about this Greek word for boasting and its broad nature. In popular English vocabulary, we think of boasting as just being the opposite of what? What do we think of the word? When we hear the English word boasting, that means the opposite of what? Yeah, it's the exact opposite of being humble. But one commentator said in the biblical period, the contrast between the two was not as stark. Boasting had within it an element of self-esteem. It was to have self-respect and respect of one's peers. In some contexts, boasting included one's sense of worth from being a skilled craftsman, a good provider for a family, or a good parent to children. It was not so much boasting in itself that the apostle was rejecting here in this context, say in verse 13 and 15, as it was, go back up into that verse 13. He said, he didn't say we will not boast, because see, he's using a Greek term that's broader than our word for boast. He says, Paul just doesn't say we will not boast, but he says we will not boast what? What's the next phrase? We will not boast beyond measure. In other words, beyond things that over which we don't have anything to do with. You know, people boast every day about things that they didn't achieve, work for, whatever. I mean, as an athlete, for instance, a world-class athlete, I think it's okay to be proud of your accomplishments and certainly of your hard work. But at the end of the day, everybody who makes it to the top of any athletic endeavor, no matter what the sport, at the end of the day, his natural ability came from where? It came from God. I mean, no matter how much I want to be a Major League Baseball player, or an NBA basketball player, or an NFL football player, or a track star, or whatever it is, or a professional tennis player, I just wasn't born with that kind of ability. And so we need to be careful about how we boast. During that time, it had an important social dimension, as humility did. He says the word boasting in Greek was broad enough to carry the notion of having given one's best efforts to a good cause. Well, that's something worth being proud of, but not the kind that we're talking about. And these men, of course, were boasting beyond measure. Paul was not. You know, and even Paul, even when he had to talk about his accomplishments, as we'll see in chapter 11, it was a very uncomfortable thing for him. I mean, it's not something Paul wanted to do, but he was put in a situation by these fellows where the Holy Spirit inspired him, where God basically said, this is what you're going to do. You know, this is the way you're going to answer these guys. And so that's what he does. And he pens this marvelous chapter 11. Verse 1. Oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly. I think the King James says, would to God. The Greek there really says, would that. You could translate it, I wish, I hope. Oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly. Well, why would he say that? Well, you've put up with these other guys, right? You've listened to what they have to say. Well, how about bearing with me for a little bit in a little folly, or sometimes translated in other versions, foolishness. He's basically apologizing for being forced, like a foolish person, to defend himself. As we said, it would have been painful for a humble person like him. In fact, he had just condemned in chapter 10 self-commendation. And so if you're going to condemn your critics for that, obviously it's not justification for you to do the same. However, he's going to have to give a defense. They're attempting to discredit him. And so it's foolish, really, for Paul to have been put in this situation. And really, the father, if you will, earthly father of this church and these people. And he says, indeed, you are bearing with me. I think you just sense the whole to me, when you read this, oh, that you would bear with me in a little folly or foolishness, and indeed you dare bear with me, it really just kind of reflects his disappointment with the whole situation that has come to this. You know, you'll bear with me a little bit, won't you? You've listened to them. Maybe you'll do that for the person that brought you the gospel, person that's put his life on the line for you. But apparently his standing had sunk low enough there that he had no choice. In chapter 10, verses 3 through 6, he used a military metaphor. He uses a different one here. Look at verse 2. For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity. I think the oldest manuscripts in the Greek, and so many of your modern versions include the word purity there. I know the New American Standard adds it. Simplicity and purity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it. You go back to chapter 10 on the military metaphor. He was ready to war against any doctrine, any philosophies that threatened the church or the gospel, to turn away believers. But here he says, I've pledged the hand of this church to the Lord in marriage. And emphasizing, therefore, that being a Christian is more than just being immersed. Because if you've been betrothed, if you've been married to Christ, that involves how long a relationship? Huh? Yeah. Doesn't that involve a lifetime relationship of faithfulness on the part of the spouse? We've seen this kind of metaphor before. The most famous passage that Paul wrote comparing the church to and its relationship to Christ and a physical marriage is found where? Yeah, Ephesians 5, right? We go to Ephesians 5 to talk about how husbands ought to love their wives, and that's fine because it does, but actually the passage is about who? It's primarily, or at least number one's focus is on Christ's relationship with his people. In fact, it wasn't summer or two ago, we did it was a couple years ago, we did a summer series called The Manifold Wisdom of God. And in that series, we took different metaphors, comparisons that the New Testament uses to compare Christ and his relationship to the church, so that we see our relationship to Christ from different perspectives, right? So, for instance, what are some of those ways that we're described as a church? We know we're described, well, he used a military metaphor early. We know we're described as his army. We're his soldiers. We're described in a marriage relationship. What else? What are some of the others that we see in the New Testament? Body. Okay, where's body, right? All that perspective that comes with that. What else? Huh? Yeah, good. Family. We're part of his family. So we got bride, family, army. What about building? Aren't we described as a temple or building? So there's a lot of ways that the church is described so that we see our relationship to Christ from different perspectives. And right here, he's talking about that marriage relationship. He pictures himself, he says, I betrothed you to one husband. In that culture of Judaism and Greco-Roman culture, the larger world there, a father or brother was responsible for the moral purity of a woman until she married. And if a bride was discovered not to be a virgin at the time of her marriage, the bridegroom would call who into account for that? The father or the brother. So, here Paul pictures himself as a father or brother, presenting his daughter to her husband. Notice as he says that I may present you as what? As they would in that culture. A chaste virgin to Christ. And when we think about the marriage relationship, we're bound together as such, husbands and wives, that what one does is what? A reflection on who? Isn't that a reflection on the other? So, if what I do is a reflection on my wife, or what my wife does is a reflection on me, then what does that say about Christ and His church? Well, I don't ever have to worry about Christ reflection, right, affecting me. Because he always does what's right. He's pure and perfect. I don't have to worry about that. But as the church, the bride of Christ, we have to be concerned about the reflection we give on Him. Our behavior. Do we glorify Him or do we shame Him? So, a lot to think about when we think about us married to Him. And of course, that analogy is not new to the New Testament, right? It was used in Hosea and some other Old Testament books, was it not? God talked about Israel being His marriage partner. And so, not new, but certainly much deeper here in the New Testament when we talk about Christ and our relationship to Him. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, his cunning, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity and purity that is in Christ. And so these guys that had come in, these critics of Paul, were using the same deceptive techniques as Satan did in the garden, which means, of course, he says corrupted from the simplicity. What was Paul's manner of conducting himself? These guys used deception. Paul says, I'm always what? When Paul presented the gospel to people, he was open. He was transparent. He was honest. He presented the gospel to people. It was up to them to accept it or not. But he wasn't going around trying to deceive people into doing something they didn't really want to do. So his work was a sharp contrast with their trickery and deceit. And of course, he was just as concerned about, just like the serpent pulled Eve away from God, he was just as concerned about these fellows pulling the Corinthians away from God. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it. You know, they accused Paul of, back in chapter 10, Paul evidently wasn't the greatest orator in the world, I guess you would say. But the gospel's always been about the message. We know people in that culture, the Greek culture, they loved to hear what? They loved to hear these professional orators, speakers. And they may not say a whole lot, but man, they were smooth. It kind of reminds me of some of the people we see today in our world who try to sound smooth but don't say a whole lot. And of course, we as Christians too many times place too much value on speaking skills. Now, I think there's obviously a balance to anything. Men don't come to preaching school so that they can leave there to put us all to sleep. That's not the purpose. Sometimes when I was young, I almost got the sense that there were some members of the church that thought that the drier the preacher, the more godly it was to sit through it and listen to him. If you could sit through this guy, then you're really something. Well, I don't want to really measure my Christianity about whether I can sit through a bad speaker. On the other hand, it's still, teachers, preachers are to be measured not by their speaking skill, but by what? Yeah, by the Word of God. Skillful speech, clever words are not the most important quality for a preacher, but his knowledge of the Scriptures and his dedication and faithfulness to the Scriptures. I can remember growing up hearing people, from congregations say, "Oh, we just heard Brother so-and-so," but instead of saying Brother so-and-so, they said, "We just hired Dr. so-and-so." Like that made it, that much better. Well, let me say this. I'm certainly not against advanced degrees, even in preaching, because those studies can be very helpful. And especially for preachers that are going on to teach other preachers and so forth, I think that's great. But that's not necessary or required, or it doesn't determine how faithful a person is. And so they're good, but they're not some required standard of measurement. And so, you can come through here and get a 2-year degree, and it seems to me, based on what I hear every Sunday from Scott, you can have a pretty extensive knowledge of Greek language and be able to impart it to the rest of us and help us see those word pictures that the Greek language gives, that no other language does, or at least the Koine Greek of that time. So degrees are good, but they're not a standard of any kind. Yeah.
I see a real dig that Paul's doing here. That Jesus a lot of times is just really, really super blunt with things, and Paul's, I think, doing the same thing here because he says, look, with the betrothal concept, I was your father,
Mm-hmm.
and I guarded your chastity, and as soon as I married you off, you're looking at other guys.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
And you're trying to go out with them.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. If you couldn't hear Dave, he said, it's like Paul saying, "I'm your father. I protected your chastity. I looked over you, and then as soon as I married you off, or not long after I married you off, you're looking at other guys. You're going a different direction than what I taught you." And I think that's a good point.
Which would have insulted somebody of that culture.
And, you know, these critics, he says, verse 4, they're misrepresenting the gospel. You know, preaching another Jesus, receiving a different spirit or a different gospel. They're compromising the essence of the message. And it's not that Paul, look, I know that Paul is not jealous of these guys' speaking ability, because I know Paul wasn't jealous of who? Apollos, right? Apollos was known to be a great speaker, and Paul speaks fondly of him, fondly of his work. So Paul didn't have a problem with good speakers, but he has a problem with people who compromise the gospel at fundamental levels. And when that happens, you're going to come face to face with Paul's authority.
That's the other thing that gets me too, is who in their right mind would pick a fight with an apostle who obviously had the authority of Jesus and was the one who distributed all the gifts and could see, I would assume, people's hearts in some cases. How is it that you even try to do that?
You know, I think when we talk about these situations and think about it today, I think we always have trouble, don't we? I mean, we ask that throughout the whole Bible, that same question. You know, Adam and Eve, walking in fellowship with God. Not like, you know, we can't, not like they were the only ones. We throw it away. We look at the children of Israel, where God says, you've tested me 10 times. Well, what had they seen? I mean, what had they seen? I mean, really, you cross the Red Sea and you're given food to eat and all these things, and you still behave the way you do. And then we think about the people that watch Jesus on a daily basis, and they were just so eager to kill him. Yeah, so yeah, it blows our minds, but you know, we're no different, you know, people today. And we think, well, I like what Jesus said. You talk about, you say, if we would have not done what our fathers did. Isn't that what the leaders of his day said? We wouldn't do what our fathers did. He said, you're the sons of them. And we say that, well, we wouldn't do what they did, but we do because we change his word and we ignore it or whatever. We do what we want to do because his word, this word is just as powerful in this form as it is when it comes straight out of his mouth. And so we do the same thing. You remember the rich man, send me back and my brothers will change. It's just humans the way we are. He said, well, look, if they won't accept Moses and the prophets, they're not going to change if I sent you back from the dead. So Paul says, look, you may well put up with it. Bear with it. You'll listen to them. Well, I think it's only fair you listen to me. For I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. Even though I am untrained in speech, yet I am not in knowledge. But we have been thoroughly manifested among you in all things. Well, obviously his detractors claimed that his apostleship and his authority was somehow different from whose? Must have been different from whose? Yeah, the original ones, right? Because after all, they got to be with Jesus for 3.5 years. And so Paul's lacking, you see. Of course, Paul's counterclaim is, look, if you go to Galatians chapter 1, I received my apostleship directly from Christ. This is an interesting passage because there's commentators kind of fall on both sides of the issue as to who he's talking about here. Is he talking about the original apostles in a respectful way, or is he in some way being sarcastic about who? Yeah, these false teachers that claim to have some kind of authority. And apparently, based on the language here, you really, either interpretation is possible. I'm going to read you what Earl says about the Greek verb hyperleon. Hyper, above, and leon, very exceedingly. So it means overmuch or preeminently, according to Thayer. Art and Gingrich, and this is where some take a different approach. Art and Gingrich suggest the translation super apostles for this Greek word, and that's what it was adopted by the NIV. And so for Art and Gingrich and other commentators, they don't believe he would use this expression of the 12, and that this is some kind of sarcastic description of Paul's attackers. In other words, these fellas, he said, look, he could be saying, I consider that I'm not inferior all to the most eminent apostles, those original 12, or he could be saying, well, I'm not inferior to any of these, quote, super apostles that are trying to infiltrate and discredit me. I'm not inferior to them. You can do your own study on that, but apparently commentators come down on both sides of that. Whether he's being sarcastic or not. And of course it can be translated eminent, but then some translate it super. And so it's an interesting concept. But he's not inferior to either one of them, whether he's talking about these false teachers or even the original 12. He does concede that he is unskilled in speech, not as eloquent perhaps not as articulate as his opponents. But that's not the chief requirement for a messenger of Christ. The Corinthians knew about those philosophers in the marketplaces of Greek and Roman cities. And so maybe his ways of sophistry and rhetoric were not as sharp as others, but he says, I'm not lacking in what, though? Knowledge. And in fact, if you're an apostle, that's about as accurate a statement as you could read. I am not lacking in knowledge. I am a walking Bible. And not only is that, but I've been open and honest with you, never used deceit. But we have been thoroughly manifested, right? Revealed. Why don't you compare the openness of my approach to the trickiness and the deception of these guys that are trying to influence you? Well, what else were they criticizing him about? This is one of those areas where you're in trouble if you do, and you're in trouble if you don't. This next area. Because they were criticizing him for what? Not doing what? For the beginning in verse 7. Criticizing him for not doing what? Taking pay from them. He didn't take any support from them. So, if Paul's not going to take support from them, what might the detractors say? Because after all, Paul's already told us that preachers, should live of the gospel, right? They're entitled. You don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain, right? So, if that's true, then Paul, why aren't you taking money or support from them? What would be the...
You must not be very good at it.
Well, either you're not very good at it or you don't have the authority you say you do. Maybe you're not really an apostle. You won't take pay. If you were really what you say you are, you'd be willing to take support. After all, preachers has a right to get paid. But on the other hand, if Paul had turned around and been taking support, what would they have said? You're just in it for the money, see? So Paul will deal with that. We'll deal with it next week.